the morning her father stood in a Chicago federal courtroom, jabbed his manicured finger directly at her face, and laughed out loud. "You're broke now, sweetheart. You have nothing. You never had anything. You never were anything." Eleanor Whitmore did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not look away. She sat perfectly still in her chair at the plaintiff's table, both hands resting flat on the surface in front of her, her breathing slow and even and completely controlled, as though the man across the aisle were commenting on the weather rather than celebrating what he believed was the final theft of everything her mother had ever built for her. Because what Eleanor knew and what Richard Whitmore did not know, and what was about to become the most expensive gap in knowledge of his entire life, was that tucked inside the mahogany leather portfolio resting calmly on the table in front of her was a single framed stock certificate, signed in faded blue ink, notarized by 2 independent witnesses, and filed with the Delaware Division of Corporations on a Tuesday in April of 1993, that was about to dismantle every lie, every fraudulent board vote, every carefully restructured shell company, and every single condescending smile her father had deployed against her for the last 11 years. What Richard Whitmore had forgotten, or rather, what he had assumed was too deeply buried in the past to ever resurface and matter, was that Eleanor Margaret Whitmore had never actually been removed from ownership of Whitmore Capital Group, the controlling share transfer he believed he had effectively erased from institutional memory through 4 corporate restructurings, a stacked board, and 11 years of managing his own daughter like a decorative figurehead in a company that legally belonged to her, had been properly recorded, properly notarized, and properly filed, and it had been sitting in a fireproof safe in a Lincoln Park study closet for 11 years waiting for exactly this moment. And when Eleanor's attorney, the formidable and meticulous Gloria Park, slid that framed certificate across the judge's bench with the calm precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment for considerably longer than 11 years, the color drained from Richard Whitmore's face so completely, so instantaneously, and so thoroughly that his $4,200 custom Brioni suit suddenly looked, in the words of the paralegal sitting 3 rows behind him in the gallery, like something purchased for a funeral. Specifically, it turned out his own. Before we go any further into this story, here is a question for every single person watching this video right now, and we want your real, honest answer in the comments. If your own father spent more than a decade pretending to be your protector, your advisor, your only remaining family, while secretly and systematically stealing the company your dying mother built with her own hands and left specifically for you, would you eventually find a way to forgive him for the sake of keeping peace in what remained of your family? Or would you spend every resource you had, every hour you could spare, and every ounce of the intelligence he spent years trying to convince you that you didn't possess, making absolutely certain that he lost everything he stole, in front of everyone who ever watched him steal it? Drop your answer below right now. And before we go any further, please like this video and subscribe to this channel, because this story has layers that are going to hit you somewhere you are not expecting. Eleanor Whitmore was not born into dysfunction. That is the important thing to understand before any of the rest of this story makes sense. She was not born into a family of chaos and cruelty. She was born into a family that had, at its center, one of the most genuinely extraordinary women in the history of Chicago's financial community. A woman whose intelligence was so clear and so consistent that it had the quality of a natural phenomenon, like weather or gravity, or the particular way the light comes off Lake Michigan on a cold November morning, when the sky is the exact same color as the water. Her mother, Catherine Ann Whitmore, had founded Whitmore Capital Group in the spring of 1987, in a rented office on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue where the elevators were slow and the coffee in the break room was consistently terrible, and the other tenants were a travel agency, a patent law firm, and a small accounting practice run by 2 brothers who played chess in the hallway during their lunch breaks. Catherine had started with $200,000, her inheritance from her own mother, a retired schoolteacher from Evanston named Margaret, who had saved that money over 40 years of careful living, and had pressed it into Catherine's hands with the specific instruction to do something real with it. Catherine had done something extremely real with it. By the time Eleanor was born in 1980, Whitmore Capital was already managing close to $50 million in assets, and had established a reputation in Chicago's mid-market private equity space that Catherine had built through the same combination of relentless preparation, precise judgment, and absolute refusal to be managed by anyone's opinion of what a woman in her position should or should not do. She had built it in rooms where she was frequently the only woman. She had built it in meetings where men talked over her and then, 3 months later, watched her turn the investments they had dismissed into returns that required them to revise their models. She had built it by being, simply and consistently and without drama, better than the people who underestimated her, which was essentially everyone she encountered in a professional context for the first 15 years of her career, including and especially her husband. Richard Whitmore was the kind of man who photographs well and presents well, and in the first 45 minutes of any introduction, creates the impression of being both charming and substantive. He was tall with the kind of jaw that reads as authoritative in a boardroom, and he had a quality of attentiveness in conversation, a way of leaning forward slightly, making direct eye contact, asking follow-up questions, that most people experienced as genuine interest, and that was, in fact, a very polished performance of genuine interest that Richard had developed over years as a reliable social tool. He had graduated from Northwestern with a degree in economics, had spent 4 years at a commercial real estate development firm in the Loop, and had then, in 1988, launched his own real estate investment vehicle with 2 partners and considerable confidence. The confidence was not matched by the performance. The real estate venture had encountered bad timing, over-leveraged positions, and the particular kind of judgment errors that occur when a man who is very skilled at appearing certain begins to confuse the performance of certainty with the actual possession of it. By 1990, the venture was quietly unwinding. Richard was 37 years old and he needed somewhere to land. Catherine had let him in because she loved him. That was the entire reason, and it was, Eleanor would think many years later, both the most human thing her mother ever did and the most costly. Catherine had brought Richard into Whitmore Capital as co-director of business development in June of 1990, and she had done it with the particular generosity of a woman who believed, with genuine warmth and without sufficient evidence, that the man she loved was capable of more than he had so far demonstrated, and that proximity to real excellence would eventually produce it. What it produced instead was resentment. Quiet, carefully managed, deeply patient resentment that Richard stored away behind his attentive eyes and his boardroom jaw and his 11-year accumulation of small, precise grievances about being subordinate, in name and in fact, to his own wife. Eleanor grew up inside this dynamic and, as children do, absorbed it without fully understanding it. What she understood was that her mother was extraordinary. She understood this the way you understand something that is simply part of the air you breathe, not as an analysis but as a baseline assumption about how the world works. Catherine was smart and warm and exacting and funny in a dry, precise way that Eleanor inherited directly. Catherine was also at home, more relaxed than she was at the office, and Eleanor had grown up with a version of her mother who sat at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings with reading glasses on the end of her nose and case files spread across the table and a mug of coffee that she refilled 3 times, humming quietly to herself while she worked, and who would look up occasionally and say something like, "Ellie, come look at this structure. Tell me what's wrong with it." And Eleanor, from the age of about 9, would come and look, and Catherine would walk her through it, and Eleanor would learn. Her father was present in her childhood in the way that secondary planets are present in a solar system. They're visible, exerting a certain gravitational force but not the source of the light. Richard attended school events and family dinners, and he took Eleanor to Cubs games 3 or 4 times every summer, and he told the people at his golf club that his daughter was brilliant and was going to run the company someday. He said it easily and publicly, and he meant it in the way that people mean things they say in social contexts, as a pleasantry, as a projection of a future that sounded good out loud, as a thing that cost nothing to say because the actual arrival of that future was still comfortably distant and theoretical. When Catherine was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of 2003, Eleanor was 23 years old and 6 months out of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. The diagnosis came suddenly, as those diagnoses tend to, following what Catherine had described as persistent back pain that she had been attributing to the hours she spent at her desk. The scan results came on a Tuesday. Catherine had called Gloria Park on Wednesday morning, before she called anyone else, including Eleanor. Gloria Park had been Catherine's attorney for 18 years. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman in her early 50s who dressed in well-made dark suits and spoke with the precise economy of someone who charges by the hour and has long since decided that imprecision is a form of disrespect to everyone in the room. She had handled every significant legal matter for Whitmore Capital Group since 1985, and she knew the firm's corporate architecture with the same intimacy that a surgeon knows anatomy. Catherine trusted her completely, which was saying something because Catherine trusted people with the same careful methodology she applied to investment decisions, deliberately, based on evidence, and not before the evidence was sufficient. What Catherine told Gloria on that Wednesday morning phone call was that she needed to move quickly and she needed to move quietly, and that the most important thing she needed to accomplish in whatever time remained to her was making certain that Eleanor's ownership of Whitmore Capital was so clearly and so legally and so irrevocably documented that no one, and Catherine did not say Richard's name, but Gloria understood precisely who she was not naming, could ever successfully argue. Otherwise, Gloria went to work immediately. She spent the following 2 weeks drafting the ownership transfer documents with the thoroughness of someone who was not simply completing a legal transaction, but constructing a fortress. The stock certificate representing 51% controlling interest in Whitmore Capital Group was prepared with 2 independent notaries, signed by Catherine at a time when Catherine's cognitive capacity and legal competence were unimpeachable and documented as such, and filed formally with the Delaware Division of Corporations on a Tuesday in April of 2003. Gloria kept 1 copy. The original, beautifully framed at Catherine's specific request, was given to Eleanor on a Sunday afternoon in the Lincoln Park living room, while Catherine sat against the cushions of the couch with ginger tea and the particular quality of attention she brought to moments she understood were important. "This is yours," Catherine said, and the way she said it, without drama, without tears, with the same clear directness she brought to everything she considered important, made it land as something more than a legal instrument. The controlling share. Not half. Not a portion. The controlling share. Whatever happens after I am gone, whatever anyone tells you, whatever documents anyone puts in front of you and asks you to sign, this is the document that tells the truth about who owns this company. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. And if they try, call Gloria. Eleanor had cried. She had held the frame against her chest and cried in a way she had not cried since childhood, because her mother was looking at her with love so direct and so complete that it felt like being seen all the way through, and because she understood in the specific way that daughters who adore their mothers understand things that are never fully said, that Catherine was not just giving her a company. She was giving her a warning about what was coming and the tools to survive it. Catherine Whitmore died on a Thursday morning in June of 2003, with Eleanor on one side of the hospital bed and Richard on the other, both of their hands in Catherine's, and the particular silence in the room that comes when the person who made the room matter is no longer in it. The funeral was attended by an enormous number of people because Catherine had touched an enormous number of lives in ways that were concrete and specific. She had mentored, she had invested, she had advocated, she had been the particular kind of person who makes other people better at their own work simply by being present. The eulogies were genuine. Richard's was polished and slightly too long and received with the respectful silence that such occasions require. The weeks after Catherine's death were, for Eleanor, the closest thing to drowning she had ever experienced. She was 23 years old and she had lost her mother, and she was the legal owner of a $400 million private equity firm, and the grief and the responsibility had combined into something that was simply too large to hold clearly. She tried to focus. She read files. She attended meetings where she was the youngest person in the room by 15 years and where she could feel, even through the haze of loss, that she was being assessed by everyone present for signs of whether she was going to be manageable. It was in this state, grieving, overwhelmed, trying very hard to appear competent, and deeply unconsciously grateful for any form of structure or guidance, that Richard came to her with the manila envelope. He had timed it well. It was a September evening, 2.5 months after Catherine's death, the specific point at which the most acute stage of grief typically begins to give way to something flatter and more functional, and Eleanor had just begun to feel like she might be capable of making decisions again. Richard sat across from her at the kitchen table of what was still technically the family home in Lincoln Park, and he had the expression of a man who finds a difficult conversation painful but necessary, which was one of the expressions he wore most convincingly. He told her that several major institutional investors had called following Catherine's death, with concerns about leadership continuity. He told her that the board, he described them as deeply experienced people who wanted to see the firm succeed, had been in discussion about the transition and had reached a consensus recommendation. He told her that given how new she was to the firm's operations, given the complexity of the current portfolio, and given the importance of maintaining investor confidence during an uncertain period, it would be best for everyone, and most importantly best for the firm that her mother had built, if Richard stepped in as acting CEO for a defined transition period, while Eleanor continued to learn the business more deeply. He slid the manila envelope across the table. He described its contents as a temporary management agreement, a straightforward administrative document that simply formalized what they were discussing. He told her that Gloria Park had reviewed it. He said the last part with the particular confidence of someone who knows it cannot be immediately verified. Gloria Park had not reviewed it. Eleanor would learn this 11 years later. Eleanor had signed the agreement that night. She had signed it because she was 23 and grieving, and her father was sitting across from her with his steady, authoritative, trustworthy face, and because the idea that he would deceive her in this specific moment, at this specific table, with her mother 3 months in the ground, was not an idea her mind was capable of holding. It was too monstrous. And so she had signed, and Richard had taken the envelope back with a warm, grateful, fatherly nod, and poured them both a glass of the very good Burgundy he had brought over, and talked to her about what the firm's next quarter was going to look like. That was the last evening Eleanor can point to where she did not, in some part of herself she mostly kept very quiet, know that something was wrong. The erosion that followed was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was so carefully paced, so incrementally constructed, and so consistently framed in the language of care and practicality and fatherly concern that Eleanor spent years doubting her own perception of it before she trusted what she was seeing clearly enough to name it. Richard excluded her from board meetings by characterizing her attendance as premature and potentially destabilizing to investor confidence. He hired Douglas Hale as CFO, a man who addressed Eleanor in the specific register of someone who has been briefed to manage rather than engage, and gave Hale operational authority that should by any reasonable reading of the firm's structure have resided with Eleanor. He restructured the firm's holding company in 2004, and again in 2006, each restructuring generating paperwork that progressively and deliberately obscured the clean line between Catherine's original filing and Eleanor's documented ownership. He moved the firm's primary banking relationship to First Meridian Capital in 2005, and ensured that he was the sole authorized signatory on the primary accounts. He had new corporate bylaws drafted in 2007 that quietly raised the threshold for major decisions to a supermajority board vote, effectively meaning that Eleanor's majority share could not translate into action without the agreement of a board that Richard had spent 4 years carefully filling with people who owed him something. All of this was done in plain sight, in the language of prudent management and careful stewardship, and each individual piece taken alone could be argued as reasonable. The pattern was only visible in aggregate, and Richard had correctly calculated that Eleanor was too close to it, too grief-softened, and too conditioned to defer to his experience to see the aggregate clearly. The micro-abuses that accompanied this structural theft were consistent and finely calibrated. At a board meeting in 2005, Eleanor presented a detailed analysis of a potential acquisition target, a regional manufacturing firm in Ohio that she had identified through 3 months of independent research and valued with meticulous precision. Richard had listened to her entire presentation with his attentive, leaning forward expression, and then had turned to Douglas Hale and said, "Let's have Douglas run a secondary analysis before we take this to the full board." Fresh eyes. The acquisition happened in 2007, led by Hale, and was considered one of the firm's signature successes of the decade. Eleanor's name appeared nowhere in the official account of it. In 2007, Eleanor retained a corporate attorney of her own, a young, sharp man named Kevin Briggs from a firm in the West Loop, to review the 2006 restructuring documents. Richard called her the morning after Briggs made his first request to the firm's legal team for documentation, and Richard's voice had the particular quiet of controlled anger, which was the closest Richard ever came to displaying genuine emotion in a conversation with his daughter. He told her that bringing in outside counsel to examine internal documents without board approval was not only procedurally incorrect but was the kind of thing that, if it became known to the firm's institutional investors, could create serious questions about the stability of the leadership team at a moment when the firm was about to close a significant fundraise. He said the words "your mother's firm" twice in the conversation, which Eleanor later recognized as the specific pressure point he returned to whenever he needed her to comply with something she would otherwise resist. She let Kevin Briggs go by end of week. By 2010, Eleanor was 30 years old, and she had been operating as Director of Strategic Development at her mother's firm for 7 years, with a title that sounded meaningful and a role that had been systematically emptied of any actual authority. She was paid well. Richard had always been careful about this, understanding that a salary that was obviously insulting would eventually produce an attorney, but she was paid at a level that bore no relationship to what she actually owned. She attended board meetings as a courtesy, was consulted on strategic matters as a courtesy, and was introduced to firm clients at dinners and events as Catherine Whitmore's daughter, which was true and which was also, Eleanor had begun to understand, a way of defining her as a legacy rather than a leader. She had relationships that her father managed to damage without appearing to damage them. The architect named Marcus, who had been kind and steady and who had started asking questions about the firm's structure that Richard found inconvenient, had received 2 separate personal phone calls from Richard that Marcus described to Eleanor only after they had broken up, calls in which Richard had expressed concern as a father about whether Marcus understood the complexity of Eleanor's situation, whether he was prepared for what that meant long-term, whether he had considered that Eleanor's role in the firm was likely to remain constrained for the foreseeable future. Marcus had not told Eleanor about the calls while they were together because he had not known how, and by the time he did tell her, the relationship was already over and it no longer mattered in the way that things stop mattering when they are already done. In 2011, Eleanor attended a financial conference in New York and met a woman named Patricia Sue, a managing director at a private equity firm in Boston, who had heard of Whitmore Capital and who asked Eleanor, with genuine professional curiosity, what her role at the firm was. Eleanor had described her title. Patricia had looked at her steadily for a moment and then said, "That's not what I asked. What is your actual role?" And something about the directness of the question, the way it cut right through the title to the reality, had landed somewhere in Eleanor with a weight that kept her awake that night in her hotel room looking at the ceiling. She had almost walked away. In the spring of 2013, Richard offered her a buyout, a formal legal buyout that valued her position in the firm at $42 million, which was a number that would provide very comfortable security for the rest of her life, and that bore approximately no relationship whatsoever to the actual value of 51% controlling interest in a firm that by 2013 was managing close to $700 million in assets. Richard had presented it as a generous offer, as a gift, as evidence of his continuing care for her financial well-being. He had said, over dinner at his Gold Coast condo, a $6.2 million renovation of a pre-war building on Astor Street, with a wine cellar that held 400 bottles and a view of the lake that Eleanor found it genuinely difficult not to admire, that he thought it might be time for her to think about what she actually wanted her own life to look like independent of the firm, independent of all the complexity, and that he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. Eleanor had said she would think about it. She had driven home that night along Lakeshore Drive and she had thought about it, seriously and genuinely, for approximately 6 weeks. She had thought about what it would feel like to put down the weight of this particular fight, to take the money, to begin again somewhere clean. She had thought about it until the day in February of 2014 when she went to clear out her mother's study in the Lincoln Park house that Richard was selling, and found the gray Sentry safe in the back of the closet, behind the case files and the childhood drawings, combination 0180, and sat on the floor and read her mother's letter and understood, with a clarity so sudden and so complete that it felt almost physical, that walking away was not something Catherine had built into the plan. She drove to Gloria Park's office on Wacker Drive without calling first. Gloria had opened her door, read Eleanor's face in approximately 2 seconds and said, "She told me you'd come eventually. I've been keeping everything." The transformation that occurred in Eleanor over the following weeks was not dramatic in appearance. It did not produce visible changes in her behavior at the office, or at the Sunday dinners at Richard's condo, or at board meetings where she continued to attend and be marginalized and say nothing that would suggest the entire landscape had shifted. Inwardly, it was the most significant change of her adult life, the replacement of doubt with certainty, the replacement of grief-softened deference with something considerably colder and more precise. She had been trying for 11 years to be a good daughter in a situation that did not reward good daughters. She was done trying. The first call she made from Gloria's office that afternoon was to Hargrove and Associates in New York, the forensic accounting firm that Gloria had already identified as the best in the country for the specific type of corporate archaeology this case was going to require. Sandra Chu, the lead forensic accountant assigned to Eleanor's matter, arrived in Chicago the following Monday morning and spent 3 months going through Whitmore Capital's corporate structure, filing records, banking documentation, and board meeting minutes with the thoroughness of someone who finds fraud not morally outrageous but intellectually fascinating, like a puzzle that someone has been impolite enough to leave unsolved in a shared space. What Sandra found, documented in a report delivered to Gloria and Eleanor in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2014, was that Richard Whitmore had conducted 4 formal corporate restructurings of Whitmore Capital's holding company between 2003 and 2013. Each restructuring had been approved by board votes, taken by board members who had been installed by Richard over the preceding decade through a combination of professional favoritism and financial arrangement. Each restructuring had generated documentation designed to progressively obscure Eleanor's controlling share under layers of new corporate architecture. Richard had also established 2 separate Delaware LLCs, Meridian Capital Partners LLC and North Shore Asset Holdings LLC, into which he had directed firm assets through management fee arrangements that were structured with sufficient technical care to resist casual scrutiny, but that, under Sandra Chu's forensic examination, were straightforwardly fraudulent misappropriation. The total value of assets redirected from the firm to Richard's personal entities over 11 years was $47,230,000, calculated to the penny. Eleanor had read that number in the conference room and had not reacted. She had taken a sip of her coffee, set the cup down precisely, straightened the already straight edge of the report, and said in a tone that Sandra Chu would later describe to colleagues as the most controlled thing she had ever heard in 30 years of corporate forensic work, "How solid is our position on the Delaware filing?" Gloria had looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses and said, "Eleanor, your mother filed that transfer properly, notarized it correctly, and recorded it with the state. Nothing Richard did between 2003 and 2013 can legally override a properly executed and recorded share transfer, unless that transfer was voluntarily relinquished by the transferee through an equally proper legal instrument. The management agreement you signed in 2003 is a management agreement. It says so in the document's own title. It is not a share transfer. It was never a share transfer. Richard has been operating for 11 years as if it were. But a management agreement does not become a share transfer because someone acts as though it does." She paused. "His case is built on a very expensive fiction. We are going to introduce it to the truth." Eleanor nodded. She closed the report. She said, "Let's build the case." What followed was 8 months of the most comprehensive legal preparation that Gloria Park, in 40 years of corporate litigation, said she had ever assembled. Gloria expanded her team to include 2 additional senior corporate litigators, a securities law specialist from a Washington firm with specific expertise in Delaware corporate law, and Sandra Chu's complete forensic accounting team. Every board vote was cross-referenced against Richard's documented relationships with each voting member. Every restructuring document was mapped against the original Delaware filing in a visual timeline that made the deliberate nature of the obscuring strategy unmistakable. Every transfer to Richard's personal LLCs was traced through banking records with complete documentation of amounts, dates, originating accounts, and receiving accounts. The $47 million figure was refined and documented with the specificity of a tax return. Every dollar accounted for, every transaction explained, every paper trail complete. And underneath all of it, at the foundation of everything, was the framed stock certificate, now preserved in archival wrapping in Gloria's office safe, with the Delaware filing confirmation and the original notarization records clipped precisely behind it. Richard filed the lawsuit in April of 2015, which was the final and, in retrospect, most revealing evidence of how completely he had misjudged the situation. He had spent 11 years managing Eleanor, managing her access to information, managing her professional relationships, managing her self-confidence with such consistent effectiveness that he had genuinely come to believe she was incapable of mounting a significant challenge to his position. The lawsuit was, in its construction, the act of a man who expects to be operating against an opponent with far less preparation than the one he was actually facing. He claimed that Eleanor had interfered with firm management, that her conduct had been professionally negligent, and, the centerpiece of the claim, that the 2003 management agreement constituted voluntary relinquishment of operational control superseding any prior ownership documentation. He retained Gerald Moss from Callaway Stern LLP, a large and expensive Chicago litigation firm with a genuine reputation for aggressive corporate defense work. Gloria received the filing, read it, and called Eleanor to describe it in 3 words: incomplete and arrogant. They submitted their response 15 days later. 53 pages, plus exhibits. The counterclaim included the Delaware certificate, the filing confirmation, the notarization records, Gloria's complete analysis of the management agreement's legal scope, Sandra Chu's full forensic accounting report, and a formal counterclaim for breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, and misappropriation of firm assets in the amount of $47,230,000. The paralegal from Gloria's office who was present at the clerk's office when Gerald Moss's team received the response filing said that Moss's junior associate had gone very still, and then walked to the corner of the room and made a phone call in a low, rapid voice. The litigation ran for 14 months. Eleanor attended every session. She prepared for every deposition with the same completeness she had learned from her mother, reading everything, preparing for every possible challenge, maintaining at all times the particular quality of composure that comes not from performing calm but from being genuinely, structurally prepared. She dressed with the same deliberateness she brought to everything during this period: the charcoal Acris pantsuit for depositions, the navy Roland Mouret for preliminary hearings, and on the days when she knew financial press would be in the courthouse hallway, the winter white Stella McCartney suit that she wore with her mother's pearl necklace and her mother's Cartier watch, which she had not taken off her wrist since finding it in the study safe in February of 2014. Richard's behavior during the litigation tracked the arc of a man encountering, for the first time, a level of preparation he had not accounted for. In early depositions he was dismissive, answering questions with the casual authority of someone who does not expect to be challenged on his answers. In the middle sessions, as Sandra Chu's forensic analysis was introduced piece by piece through discovery, he became aggressive, objecting through Moss to document requests, challenging the methodologies, attacking the timeline. In the final sessions, something flatter and more inward replaced the aggression. He contradicted himself twice on material dates. His memory of specific transactions became, under cross-examination, remarkably and conveniently unreliable. The night before the final hearing, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table in her near North Side apartment, a quietly beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake and bookshelves that covered the entire north wall, and reviewed her notes one final time. She ran 3 miles on the lakefront path at 5:30 in the morning. She showered and dressed with particular care. She placed her mother's watch on her wrist. She picked up the mahogany leather portfolio from the table where she had placed it the night before, already containing the archivally preserved framed certificate and all accompanying documentation. She stood for a moment in the quiet of her apartment before leaving for the courthouse. On the bookshelf beside her door, she had kept the framed stock certificate for the 14 months of litigation, and now its place was empty, and she looked at that empty space for a few seconds. Then she left. The final hearing was held on a Thursday morning in September of 2015, in a federal courtroom on the 23rd floor of the Dirksen United States Courthouse. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, afternoon light that came in sideways from windows that faced north. The gallery was fuller than Eleanor had expected: financial press, people from the investment community, 2 of Richard's golf club friends in the back row who had come expecting a different conclusion. Richard arrived with Gerald Moss and 2 associates. He was wearing the Brioni suit. He looked at Eleanor across the aisle with the expression she had been watching her entire life, and had finally, completely stopped finding painful. Final arguments ran through the morning. Moss was skilled and thorough and made the strongest case available for his client's position, which was a position built on a management agreement that said nothing about share ownership, and a decade of behavior that could be characterized as management, but could not be characterized as legal title. Gloria's argument was quieter and more precise, the way arguments are quiet and precise when the facts are entirely on one side and the advocate knows it and is content to let the facts do the majority of the work. She cited the Delaware filing. She cited the 3 relevant precedents. She summarized Sandra Chu's forensic findings in 6 sentences that together constituted one of the most economical and complete descriptions of 11 years of fraud that any courtroom had heard. When Gloria sat down, the judge asked for any final evidentiary submissions. It was at this moment, in the 2 seconds of procedural pause before Gloria stood to present the certificate, that Richard leaned across the aisle. He said it quietly. He said it with the remnants of the smile he had worn for 11 years. He said, "You're broke now, sweetheart. You have nothing. You never had anything. Eleanor looked at him for 3 full seconds, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of imminent victory, with something quieter and more complete than either, the look of someone who has been preparing for a moment for a very long time and has arrived at it exactly as prepared as they intended to be, and finds it neither surprising nor triumphant but simply true. She opened the mahogany portfolio. Gloria presented the framed stock certificate as the final evidentiary exhibit. The certificate, the Delaware filing confirmation, the original notarization records, the chain of custody affidavit. The judge examined the documents for 4 minutes. The courtroom was completely silent. Gerald Moss had turned in his chair and was looking at Richard with the face of a lawyer receiving information he should have had 14 months ago. Richard was looking at the certificate with the fixed expression of a man whose mind is working very quickly and arriving at very bad destinations. The judge's ruling was measured, precise, and unambiguous. The transfer of ownership recorded with the state of Delaware in 1993 was a properly executed and legally recorded instrument. It predated and superseded all subsequent corporate restructuring activity. The management agreement of 2003 was properly characterized as what it said it was. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore was confirmed as the majority shareholder and legal controlling owner of Whitmore Capital Group. The counterclaims forensic evidence would proceed to a separate damages hearing. Richard Whitmore did not speak. He did not move for a long time. The golf club friends left the gallery very quietly. Gerald Moss gathered his papers with professional economy. Eleanor stood, buttoned her jacket, picked up the mahogany portfolio and walked out. The damages hearing 3 months later produced a judgment against Richard personally of $39 million. The judgment moved through his finances like a fault line. The Gold Coast condo went first, listed in November, sold in February at a loss because the timeline required it. The Hamptons house followed in the spring. The wine cellar, valued at $112,000, was auctioned. The car collection, a 1968 Porsche 911, a 2012 Mercedes S-Class, a Range Rover was liquidated. Gerald Moss's firm placed a lien for unpaid legal fees of $800,000. By the spring of 2016, Richard Whitmore was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Skokie in a building that was entirely adequate and that Richard, having spent 20 years in Gold Coast condominiums and Hamptons estates, found impossible to experience as adequate. He was 63 years old. His calls to former board members and financial community contacts went unanswered with the smooth, efficient unanimity of people who had always been allies of his position rather than of him personally, and who now found his position, and therefore him, unreachable. He tried a consulting engagement in Indianapolis in 2017 that lasted 4 months before the firm's due diligence process became more thorough than the engagement could survive. He sold the Brioni suits one by one over the following 2 years, which was the detail that said more about him than anything else, the way he held on to each one as though it represented the argument that the situation was still temporary, that the reversal was still coming. He died in 2021 in the Skokie apartment of a heart attack. The Tribune ran a brief notice. Eleanor read it in her office on a Thursday morning, sitting at her mother's glass desk, with the lake visible through the window behind her. She sat with it for 20 minutes and felt, not triumph, but a sadness for the version of her father she had spent a long time wishing existed, the father who might have loved her without condition, who might have looked at what Catherine built and been proud rather than resentful, who might have stood beside his daughter instead of spending 11 years standing in her way. That version of him had never existed anywhere except in the hope she had carried for him. But she had carried it for a long time, and letting go of hope, even hope that was never justified, is still a kind of loss. After 20 minutes she picked up the phone and called her CFO with a question about a deal that needed her attention before end of day. Eleanor had moved into the CEO role at Whitmore Capital in the weeks following the final hearing. She did it without announcement, without ceremony, without any of the performance that Richard had always brought to questions of authority. She came in on a Monday morning in her Acris suit, met with the senior team, and spent 3 weeks reading every file, reviewing every current position, and meeting one by one with every major investor in a series of conversations that were direct and thorough and that communicated, without needing to say it explicitly, that the woman across the table had been watching this firm very carefully for 11 years, and was ready to run it. The investors stayed. Most expanded their commitments. She replaced Douglas Hale with the CFO she recruited from a Boston-based firm. A precise, highly regarded woman named Anita Sharma, who had spent 12 years doing exactly the kind of rigorous financial management that the firm's current moment required. She hired extensively from talent pools that were underrepresented in private equity, and did so without press releases, because she was not interested in credit for doing what she considered simply correct. She funded a scholarship in Catherine's name at the University of Chicago, 30 annual scholarships for women pursuing graduate degrees in finance or economics, and declined the naming ceremony and the donor dinner and the framed portrait that the university offered. She bought a house in Lincoln Park, 3 blocks from the house where she had grown up, and she built out the study with the same bookshelves and the same quality of afternoon light. She ran on the lakefront path in the early mornings. She had dinner with Gloria Park once a month until Gloria retired, and afterward they spoke every few weeks by phone in the easy, warm manner of people who have been through something significant together and no longer need to talk about it to remember what it meant. On the mantel in the living room of the Lincoln Park house, in the spot where the afternoon light came through the west windows and fell in a particular clean rectangle on the painted plaster, she placed the framed stock certificate, the original in its archival frame, signed in faded blue ink in 1993 by a woman who had loved her daughter clearly enough and specifically enough to build the truth into a fireproof container and leave it precisely where it could be found. Whitmore Capital Group crossed $1 billion in assets under management in 2019. Eleanor was invited to keynote a financial conference in New York that same year, and at the end of her remarks, a member of the audience asked her what she considered the most important professional lesson she had ever learned. Eleanor considered the question for a moment. Then she said, "Document everything. And trust your mother." The audience laughed warmly. Eleanor smiled. It was not the complete answer. The complete answer was longer and quieter and far more personal than any conference stage could hold. The complete answer had to do with a Sunday afternoon in April, and ginger tea, and a woman whose love for her daughter was so clear and so specific and so practical that it had survived 11 years in a fireproof safe and arrived exactly when it was needed, with exactly the weight it had always carried. The complete answer was about the particular kind of strength that does not perform itself, does not require an audience, does not need to be loud to be absolute, the kind that simply waits, patient and certain and completely prepared, for the moment when it is needed. The complete answer was combination 0180. The complete answer was a colored marker drawing of the Chicago skyline, still carefully preserved, hanging in the corner of an office that had always, by law and by love, belonged to the woman who sat beneath it every morning and did the most important thing her mother had ever taught her to do. She thought, and Eleanor Whitmore thought with the same unhurried, precise clarity that Catherine had modeled for her at that kitchen table on Saturday mornings 30 years ago, with reading glasses on the end of her nose and case files spread across the table and the whole city of Chicago waiting outside the window, full of people building things and protecting things and occasionally losing things they should not have lost. And Eleanor Whitmore thought and planned and decided and acted and continued to do so every morning in the office that bore her name and the firm that bore her mother's name and the city that had watched the whole thing happen and would, she understood, remember it not as a scandal or a legal proceeding or a corporate drama, but as the story of a woman who was given something real by someone who loved her, and who had the patience and the clarity and the absolute, unmovable conviction to keep it. There is a particular kind of person who, when they are wronged, responds with noise, who announces their grievance to everyone available, who makes their pain the loudest thing in the room, who measures their vindication by the volume of the response it generates. Eleanor Whitmore was not that person. She had never been that person. She was the person who sits very still in a federal courtroom while her father tells her she has nothing, and who opens a portfolio and hands a piece of paper to her attorney, and who watches 11 years of carefully constructed fraud dissolve in 4 minutes of a judge reading documents, and who then stands up, buttons her jacket, and walks out into the September morning without saying a single unnecessary word. That quality, that specific quality of stillness in the face of provocation, of precision in the face of chaos, of patience in the face of people who count on impatience to protect them, was not something Eleanor had learned at Booth. It was not something she had developed in 14 months of litigation or in the 31 years of her adult life. It was something she had absorbed in a kitchen in Lincoln Park on Saturday mornings, watching a woman in reading glasses work through case files with a mug of coffee and a quiet hum, and understanding without being explicitly told that the most powerful thing a person can do is think clearly and wait for the right moment, and then, when the moment comes, act with complete and total preparation. Catherine Whitmore had given her daughter 3 things. She had given her a company, she had given her a certificate, and she had given her over 23 years of Saturday mornings and office visits and ginger tea conversations and one final Sunday afternoon in a living room in Lincoln Park, the particular kind of mind that knows how to use both. The company was worth considerably more than $1 billion in 2024. Eleanor ran it with the same methodical, principled excellence that Catherine had brought to it in 1987 in a rented office on Michigan Avenue with slow elevators and bad coffee. She still ran on the lakefront path at 6 in the morning. She still wore Catherine's Cartier watch on her left wrist every day. She still paused every morning when she arrived at her office, at the colored marker drawing of the Chicago skyline in the corner, the drawing that a 7-year-old girl had made on a yellow legal pad on the first morning she ever understood that this was the place where thinking happened, and that thinking was the most important thing. The framed stock certificate sat on the mantel at home in Lincoln Park, where the afternoon light found it every day at the same time, falling clean and specific and entirely unhurried across the faded blue ink of her mother's signature, and the notary seal, and the words that had always been true and were now, finally and permanently, undeniable. Whitmore Capital Group. Controlling interest. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore. Her mother had known. Her mother had always known. And she had made sure that Eleanor would know too eventually when she was ready, when she had arrived at the moment that required it. The combination was 0180, the month and the year of Eleanor's birth. The thing Catherine Whitmore had considered most worth protecting. Not the company, not the certificate, not the $47 million or the billion in assets or the name on the letterhead or any of the things that Richard had spent 11 years stealing and the law had spent 14 months returning. Her daughter. That was what Catherine had been protecting from the beginning, with the documents and the safe and the letter and the attorney on speed dial and the very precise, very quiet, very comprehensive legal architecture she had assembled in the last weeks of her life between rounds of chemotherapy. Not the company, the person who should run it. The person she had been watching and teaching and preparing since a Saturday morning in 1987, when a 7-year-old girl sat at the corner of a glass desk with a yellow legal pad and colored markers, and drew a picture of a city she was going to spend her life helping to build. Eleanor Whitmore looked out at Lake Michigan from the window of her office on a clear morning in the fall, with the water the same deep blue it had been on the morning she walked out of the Dirksen courthouse 9 years ago, and she thought, as she did every morning in some quiet part of herself that did not require words, about her mother. She thought, I kept it. And she had.